Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Good morning for those of you in the US. My name is Sookia. I'm a client success manager at Centuro Global, and I just want to thank you all for joining today's webinar. Today, it's the only topic that's on our minds. We're going to be covering 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency and this new age of uncertainty for immigration. Just to go into a bit more about what we're going to be talking about today, we will be exploring what the impact has been 100 days on from Donald Trump being inaugurated as President of the United States for the second time. Some of the things that we're going to be touching on today are Donald Trump's executive orders and new policies, travel bans, potential risk mitigation strategies and alternative pathways, the ongoing issues with students in the US, and some sector level disruption, as well as AI talent being in the crossfire of all of these changes. And we're finally going to touch on what the future outlook will be for business continuity. But before we get started, a little bit about who we are at Centuro Global. If you're watching this, you know that getting the right people to the right place at the right time while staying compliant is not an easy task. So at Centuro, our goal is to take the hassle out of managing a global workforce, especially in industries where things are fast-paced. And to do that, we use AI-powered technology and human expertise to ensure that teams can really focus on the important elements of global mobility, whether it be in relation to immigration, tax, or HR compliance detail, to make sure every area of global mobility is managed seamlessly. Before we get into the meat of today's discussion, I do want to touch on a few quick housekeeping points before we get started. So this session is being recorded. If anyone misses anything or wants to revisit the discussion, we will share a recording with anyone that is attending afterwards or has registered. We also want people to participate, so please do drop a question in the comments through the webinar, and we love people engaging on social media. So please tag us at Centuro Global, and we'll be happy to engage with your posts. Without further ado, I'm really, really excited for this one today. I'm excited for all of them, but this one in particular, because I'd love to introduce my collaborator on the discussion. His name is Greg Siskind. Hi there, Greg.
Hey, Ben.
Hey, Greg is the co-founder of VisaLaw.ai. He's also the co-founder of Siskind Sussa, which is a US immigration law firm. Greg, there's so much that you've covered in your career so far. So do you maybe want to just give us a quick introduction about yourself and what you've done and what Visa Law currently do?
Sure. So I have been practicing law since 1990 and doing immigration for most of that time. My practice has been generally on the employment side of immigration, although our firm is what's called a full service firm. So we do all kinds of immigration beyond just employers and investors. I also have been involved in legal technology since the beginning of my career. Our firm is credited with having the first website in immigration law back 31 years ago. And then later on, we got into the AI space, and we have been developing AI apps now for about 10 years also, and in the generative AI space for the last 2 years.
Great, thanks, Greg. Really appreciate that. You've got so much you've covered so much. We could spend the whole kind of conversation covering your career, but I know we're here today to talk about Donald Trump and what has happened in the first 100 days. So I think we're really going to be covering why the first 100 days of a new Trump administration could potentially reshape global mobility, some of the implications of a second Trump term for cross-border teams, and also what potential solutions there might be to support with talent and preserving workforce stability in the US. So those are the kind of main areas that we're going to be touching on today. Let's move on to the first agenda topic. Greg, what are your thoughts in terms of what Trump's first administration and also combining with Biden's final moves, what are the implications in terms of the immigration outlook in the US based on those two scenarios combined?
Yeah, so even though it seems like a million years ago since we had a President Biden, you typically see at the end of a president's term, when they know they're going to be leaving, a rush to try and cement changes that they want to leave permanently. And in the U.S., we have this very complicated system under something called the Administrative Procedures Act, where it's a rulemaking process. It can sometimes take many, many months to get rules in place, but if you do it correctly, it's very hard to undo those rules. And President Biden did a couple of big things at the end that he managed to cement in via regulation. One is on the is a very substantial rule on H-1Bs that should make the process generally easier. A little bit more restrictive on wage rules, but generally speaking, very highly favored by the business community as far as the changes that were made in the H-1B regulation. H-2 is a category a lot of people probably aren't as familiar with, but the H-2B visa is for lower skilled temporary workers. It doesn't have to be lower skilled, but that's generally who it's used for. People that are coming in for temporary, seasonal, or short-term projects. And then the H-2A is for agricultural workers. Big changes there as well. He also had, for most of his term, had created these humanitarian parole programs, which allowed almost 1 million people to enter the United States. He tried to make some changes at the end to extend those programs out longer and make it harder for the administration to undo those. And then finally, he had an AI executive order maybe about a year before he left, but it was starting to actually get an executive order is when a president said, this is what I want my agencies to do. And then the agencies follow on that. And the Immigration Service had issued changes to its policy manual to try and make it easier for AI workers, machine learning folks, and others in that space to make it easier for them to qualify, for example, for O-1 visas, which we're going to be talking about later, in other categories. So that was all good, except when Trump comes in, and we had I guess the one thing that's sort of like immigration lawyers are obviously not happy that Trump came in, but we were also not. It's not as shocking for us as it was 8 years ago. So we had already sort of see how the playbook works and kind of know what we were going to need to do. But we knew that he would do a lot of executive orders at the beginning. He actually did a lot more executive orders on immigration than he did at the first in 2017 when he came in. But we had we saw those come in. One of them actually said specifically Biden's AI executive order is no more on there. And he replaced it with another executive order, which was kind of the same thing. So I guess he just wanted to take credit for whatever good things are going to happen in AI on there. But that's what we're going to be talking about today, is sort of what the fallout has been from these executive orders. And also there have been, and it's noted here, a lot of changes that are sort of were not really anticipated, like massive downsizing of federal agencies. These are things that I guess he probably talked a little bit about it during the campaign, but there have been a fair number of surprises as far as his priorities, whether it's firing a lot of federal workers or tariffs or all the things that have been making global news. On immigration, he was pretty transparent that he just wanted to get rid of a lot of people. But it was mostly focused on trying to get rid of criminals. And as we're going to be talking about, criminals are hard to find. It's easy to find people that are in the U.S. legally doing things the way they're supposed to be doing. And it's not a surprise that they have this magic number of 1 million people a year that they want to remove from the United States. And it's not easy to get to that number when the highest number ever before that was 400,000 under President Obama. So that's if you kind of keep that in mind as the theme they want of trying to get to that number, it kind of explains why they're pursuing some of the policies they're pursuing.
Interesting. Just a quick question on like the executive orders. You mentioned there were more in the second presidency, this current
Yeah.
one. Is there a feeling as to why that might be? Is it because he spoke about it in the run up to the election, or do you know
Well,
why that might be?
I mean, part of it is probably that he gave Stephen Miller, who was, helping him with immigration policy, a much higher position. This
Yeah.
time he's the deputy chief of staff, which is like,
Yeah.
he has his own office like two doors down from the president. And he was, he was during the 4 years between administrations. He was he was a senior person at a anti-immigration group that does a lot of policy work, and it seemed like they had a lot of things queued up from his work over the last 4 years, and he had a lot of experience from the first 4 years on how things worked. And I think that was, it was easier probably in some respects to go after to fight some of the policies because they just were not very experienced at it. This time, I think they're a little more savvy.
Yeah, it does feel that things are much more planned, and I mean, they seem like things are volatile,
They're
but
still
things
losing
seem
a
to be.
lot.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking about that too. But that's the,
Mm.
as far as hope goes, they get sued a lot and they lose a lot, and they seem to be, despite the headlines, following the court orders.
Interesting. So let's dip into those policies, the new policies, in a bit more detail, if that's okay. Do you
Yeah.
want to just run us through some of the new measures that have been introduced? We could talk about this for quite some time, but if you could just give a snapshot as to the new policies and a bit of analysis on those, if that would be great.
Yeah. So if people remember back 8 years ago, one of the first things that the president did was issue a travel ban on people coming from a half a dozen countries, and they all happen to be Muslim countries. So that's why it was called the Muslim ban. That went through a long legal battle, and eventually the Supreme Court upheld it with various conditions. And you had to go through this process, and you have to have State Department issue, basically a report explaining why the country needs to have a travel ban. And so he issued an executive order on day one saying, I would like to have a report on my desk in April, which I presume this report has already landed on his desk, saying which countries should be subject to it. And the New York Times leaked something. I don't know if it's changed or not. It's been more than a month since it leaked, with a list with about 43 different countries on it that were being looked at for bans. And it was a much more complicated system. And I think we have a slide later on it. But that's so travel bans are coming probably fairly soon. What they look like is still not entirely clear. There's not a lot been reported since that story. Birthright citizenship. This is one that also caused a big freak out in the United States and probably got a lot of headlines outside the U.S. But the U.S. has always been, no, it hasn't always been, since the Civil War. After the Civil War, there was an amendment to the Constitution on basically enshrining birthright citizenship as a right of all people that are born in the United States, with the exception of children of diplomats, are the only ones that don't get it. And that was done because there was worry that, there was worry about slaves that were now free getting full rights. And so that was why that was there. There was another Supreme Court case in the 1890s. And we pretty much have no argument over this for the entire rest of the country's history until President Trump. That one got, he issued an executive order. By the way, it wasn't, he said, anybody who had a child who is a child of a parent who was out of status doesn't get it, but also anybody who is a child of a parent on a non-immigrant visa wouldn't get it.
Oh, wow.
It's really important probably for a lot of people that are listening here, because that means children of H-1Bs, children of O-1s don't get it, and that is going to be a tremendous disincentive for coming to the United States if it happened. Happily, there were 4 lawsuits that were filed within 48 hours of the of this order, and there were restraining orders in all 4 of those. Supreme Court is going to be reviewing this, but even though the Supreme Court, a lot of people know it's conservative, and Trump appointed several other people there, we're relatively optimistic that that's not going to happen. That they're not going to allow this. Certainly not by an executive order.
Interesting. So, what do you think this means for the next 4 years? Because we're very early on in Trump's presidency, but
well, it seems like they issue these orders, and I think the hope is that they know they're going to get knocked down by the courts at the lower levels, and they're hoping that some of them will make it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will say that they are acceptable. That I think is the strategy. Is things that are really kind of shocking and appear to be unconstitutional. I think their hope is that they can make their arguments there. But this court is not as cooperative as I think the White House was hoping. They've already had a number of losses there, and including some on immigration.
Interesting. Okay, let's maybe move on to one of the hot topics, the one that people are asking about. I know that there may be some clarity on it soon. But what is a travel ban going to look like? How will it work? And what are the sort of delays and pushbacks that we are likely to see, that we're seeing already? Could you maybe elaborate on that if possible?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you what we know. There's a lot more unknown than known at this point. Right. But so that New York Times story that leaked has really been the only major report that we have right now. And according to the Times, those 43 countries are classified by color: red, orange, and yellow. And red means basically, like, right off the bat, they're going to have a ban like last time. And there looked like there were like 6 or 7 countries that were in that category. It was a little surprising, the list that they were reporting, because it included some of the countries that you would expect that were there the last time, but it also included Russia, which was a bit of a surprise because this administration is supposedly friendlier. The orange is basically a ban, but not a total ban. Like, people can come over for business purposes and things like that. Not really clear what the exceptions are going to be yet. Yellow means that they're sort of under investigation. And there's no restrictions yet, but they're sort of on notice that if they don't make certain changes, and one of the big changes they have been pushing for is requiring countries to accept their foreign nationals back when they're being deported. There are several countries still that don't like to take after somebody's been in jail in the United States and they're being deported back to their home country. The country says, no, we're not taking them. So that seems to be one of the also the groups that are and one of the conditions probably that's going to trigger bans from those countries. And I think we already saw that from South Sudan. Yes. There actually has been a ban for just that country on just that issue, even though I don't think we get all that many travelers from there. So that's one thing that people will sort of have to be paying a close look at. The way it worked the last time, and I'm sure it will be this time, is there were a number of exceptions. The exceptions generally included green card holders, people with permanent residency. We don't know, by the way, if that's going to be the case with these travel bans. In fact, yesterday, Trump on social media made some kind of comment, to a warning to green card holders in the United States that they better behave, otherwise there are going to be consequences, which sounded, the typical ominous threats. But that's something that it wouldn't surprise me in the travel bans if they tried to do that. Now, that would be a really hard thing for them to defend in court, but that's something that I can see them doing. There have been other changes, and I think this particular slide, I think we should spend a little more time on, because I think probably a lot of the people that are watching this are probably going to be really affected by a lot of the things that in these bullet points. One of the big things that happened the last time, and it's even worse this time, is when Trump came in last time, there was a mass resignation of consular officers around the world, and that caused a big backlog at consulates at the beginning of the administration and for really the entire 4 years. And it took a while, even in the Biden administration, to kind of higher up and get back to where they were. But that is something you should expect. A lot more, I mean, a lot fewer officers. We also know that the State Department is floating this plan now to close a lot of consulates around the world, including, remarkably, I think all the consulates in Africa, which is just unbelievable.
So what would happen? What would happen there then?
People have to go to third countries and process. And that means that they're going to have to travel somewhere else and get a visa, potentially a very far, long distance away. We will see on that. That's what we saw the first time were big announcements of things that didn't actually end up happening. But that's one thing to keep a very close eye on. They did have it could be tech also would, they might feel more comfortable with using, doing video interviews and other things that they were experimenting with during COVID. But I'm not super optimistic. If anything, that makes things easier. But look for that. Administrative, there's another thing that it wasn't an executive order requiring the State Department to do something called extreme vetting. Which means a lot of checking of social media and a lot of more background checking of people that are coming in. That all takes time. And one of the things that that hasn't been reported on that much was there have been orders sent down from the Secretary of State to heads of consulates to dramatically cut their local staff. And these are people who are nationals of the country of wherever the U.S. consulate is, and those are the people that are doing the vetting in a lot of cases. They're the ones that are on the computers checking everything that needs to be checked in administrative processing. So that's going to take longer. Also, they're doing more vetting with fewer people, which just is a recipe for slowdowns. So that's the thing that. And we'll be talking about that later in terms of how to be proactive, is just to give yourself a lot more time than you did before. We had on here as well, one of the things that is in court right now are rules relating to transgender folks. One of the things that they are now, and this is probably something a lot of people have heard about, but they, if a person is transgender, even if their passport has been changed by their country, if they don't describe themselves in all applications based on the sex they were at birth, it will be considered immigration fraud, which can have very serious consequences. So people that are in that category are facing a very difficult choice. Being truthful with themselves and answering the questions the way that they should, versus the way the administration wants them to answer the questions. And that's something that they either going to have to follow those rules, or they're going to have to wait until the litigation is done. Things are restored back. Now, with that being said, they also had a transgender ban in the military, and that has already been thrown out by the courts. So there has been at least one case so far on that issue, not on the immigration issue, but on the military issue, where the administration's already lost. So those are a few of the things that are happening at the consular level, and you'll just going to have to keep an eye on all of these things.
Sure. Let's just touch on that last point, and it's a bit of a segue into the next slide. But what are the possible implications for mobility and business continuity, especially when it comes to these sensitive issues like, as you mentioned, the transgender specific visa denials, because those do potentially blend into each other, but it does have a knock-on effect on business. So what are your thoughts on that as we move on to the next slide, which dives deeper into that?
Well, so there is this tension that's going on in the administration right now that is worth mentioning, and probably, again, something that it's been reported a lot in the media, but in the US, and I don't know if it's quite as much abroad, but there's the Elon camp, the Elon Musk camp, and the Stephen Miller camp. And Stephen Miller, as I said, is deputy chief of staff, one of the most important people in the administration, and one of the biggest anti-immigrants in the country, who is in charge of immigration policy for the administration. He's on one side, you know where he is on all these issues. He would like to basically stop all immigration in any sort if he could. On the other side is the richest man in the world, who is also one of the most influential people in the administration, Elon Musk. Elon has said he picked a fight before the inauguration over the H-1B issue and over skilled workers in general, and found a couple of other very influential Republicans to basically issue warnings to the incoming administration to lay off business immigration. And Elon Musk, I think, had even put a on his, you can't call them tweets anymore, he put a an X post or whatever they call it, on his, saying basically, over his dead body, are they going to make changes to make H-1Bs harder to get? Now, keeping all that in the background, the one big difference between this campaign that was run and the one before was who was paying for a lot of the campaign, and a lot of it was being paid by Silicon Valley billionaires who are think very differently on immigration issues than obviously Miller does. And so far, what seems to be happening is that you are not seeing anything really at this point of any major significance on skilled worker green card categories or skilled worker non-immigrant categories. Very little at this point directly affecting. What I think the strategy is to kind of like make changes that don't, that will make it harder in those categories, but on a direct attack on those categories. So I think we'll probably see sort of business as usual. Like we just had the H-1B lottery that just happened in the U.S. It happens at the end of March, and that went very smoothly and no problems on there. So, we haven't seen any proposed rules yet on H-1Bs, O-1s, or any of those categories. But as I said, extreme vetting, slower processing at consulates, more, all that kind of stuff has an impact on those categories, but not a direct assault on any of those categories like we saw in the first administration.
Yeah, for sure. And so just going a bit deeper into that topic, we thought it would be good to put out some examples of more specific compliance pressures that are being forced on HR and mobility professionals. Do you want to touch on some of these in particular that we could maybe elaborate?
I think for the mobility, so we didn't, I think it was on one of your earlier slides, and I didn't talk about it, but there is this new it's a new old requirement. There's this registration requirement where you go online, you provide basically some information on where you are in the U.S. and it's just, it's designed to track all immigrants, and that's actually been in the statutes for decades, probably 50 years or more, that there was something like this, and it's never been actually deployed. So this is an example of sort of like a savvier anti-immigrant community in DC that realized, hey, this could be essentially weaponized for our purposes on there. So what they did was they created this online registration system, mostly targeted to people in the U.S. without immigration status, basically telling them that if you don't out yourselves and fill out this online form, you're committing a misdemeanor, and you can be, potentially jailed for that. But more importantly, you can be barred from any future ability to get your immigration status in order. Now that registration system applies to everybody, but there are such big exceptions that most HR people are not going to be having to worry about it too much. So generally speaking, if you have been fingerprinted at any point in the immigration process, which everybody that's coming in on visas from consulates have, if you got a 994 when you entered the United States, which most people have, if they're coming as a tourist or if they're coming on a work visa category, they're not included. Canadians are an exception to that because Canadians don't actually get an I-94. And
Right.
Canada is not a favored country right now by the Trump administration, which I'm sure was happy to make make one more thing difficult for Canadians. I'm sure the election this week in Canada is not making him any happier about it. But so Canadians have to register if they are. You get 30 days basically, and after that you have to register. Also, minors that are under the age of 14, when they turn 14, even if they're like an H4 coming with a parent, they have to register after their 14th birthday online. So keep it in mind that even though the people that you're normally thinking about, the the high skilled employees and corporate transferees and all that you're normally dealing with, most of those won't have to register. Their children don't have to register when they're over 14 when they're coming in, but if they're under 14, when they turn 14, they have to register. And I have a feeling a lot of people are going to get caught by that one without knowledge. So keep in mind that you have to at least be aware of that rule. So I don't know if you want me to kind of go through some of the other bullet points here.
Yeah.
But the one of the things that probably doesn't have that much of an effect, except for people that are in the healthcare sector, is that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they're the ones that do all the deporting of people. They are now able to do operations inside schools, inside churches, inside hospitals. So that's something that is, at least for healthcare employers in the U.S., they've had to react to that. There are a bunch of new immigration forms that basically most of the immigration forms have turned over so that the forms look very similar. So I don't think I would worry too much about sort of it being more difficult, but they're using that goes back to that transgender issue where they're now they're taking out all language that was potentially sympathetic on that issue.
Yeah.
The litigation stuff is something that I'm deeply immersed in, and Ben and I were talking beforehand. I'm going to actually be a lawyer on a class action suit for 500 students that's being filed today on there. But there have been a lot of lawsuits on a lot of issues. I would say sort of like 90% of them have been successful on the immigration front from the perspective of the immigration bar. But the administration is, they're appealing a lot of things, and it's still kind of murky where things are going to be going. But one thing that's a compliance perspective is that you not only have to be aware of what the rules are, but you have to be aware of what is being challenged and where those challenges are, and you have to be prepared to react sometimes relatively quickly to changes that are being ordered by courts. So I think it's important to have in a lot of these cases to be at least watching the news on what's happening with lawsuits. And
just to touch on the litigation risks and the lawsuits, we've mentioned there AILA, who are the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Some of our audience may not be familiar with AILA. I know that's an association that you've been part of for some time. Perhaps if you just give a quick explanation as to who AILA are, but also what sort of dialogue there is between the current administration and AILA, if that's okay, Greg.
Yeah. So AILA is the American Immigration Lawyers Association. It is has about 17,000 immigration lawyers in the U.S. that are members. It is one of the bar. A lot of lawyers don't join bar associations, but almost every immigration lawyer who does immigration work on a full-time basis is a member of AILA. So they probably have 80-90% of the immigration bar that are members. AILA does things that bar associations do as far as just helping their members out, but they also file a lot of lawsuits and support lawyers that are filing lawsuits against the administration to promote pro-immigration policies. So sometimes, a lot of times they're successful, sometimes they're not. Like on the they sued on the registration program and didn't get a friendly judge on that. So that's why the registration was allowed to proceed earlier this month. But they have been successful on a lot of issues. They are have been involved, like, with the on the student issues, which I think we have a slide later on that. But they, in terms of basically making it easier for the lawyers that are working on these cases around the country to have conversations and make sure that we're all basically trying to do things in a way that are helping the issue, not hurting the issue. Sometimes you want to be careful where you file suits, and what you're filing suits over.
Absolutely. And sort of on that theme, I think it would be useful now for us to touch on what potential solutions they are, in particular for HR and mobility professionals. So maybe we can take some time to look into alternative options and what contingency planning can take place.
Yeah.
Greg, thoughts on this?
Well, first off, I mean, the H-1B is always the workhorse visa, and I actually have some good news for people on the H-1B front that doesn't really have anything to do with Trump, but it's happening. It's happening in the Trump administration, but these are changes that started a long time before. So I mentioned that on lawsuits. One of the suits that I was involved with a couple of years ago, where we sued the Biden administration, involved H-1Bs where there was a gaming problem that happened with H-1Bs. A lot of people know that there's a lottery for H-1Bs, and there's a 65,000 main lottery and then 20,000 for advanced degree workers. And there had been a problem, particularly with staffing companies, IT folks, mostly involving Indian IT workers, where it basically was an employer lottery. So if you had 10 employers filing H-1Bs for the same person, the person essentially had 1,000% chance, an improved chance of getting an H-1B. And that had been the case for decades, but it had gotten to be a major problem where we all of a sudden, saw applications go from like 200,000 in a year to about 700,000 in a year over like 3 or 4 years. Even though big changes were not happening in the economy or in the employer market. So they flipped the lottery to a beneficiary lottery 2 years ago. Well, this is the second year that they've had it. And that meant that you can have as many employers file for you as you want, but the algorithm is only going to count you once in the lottery. So last year, the odds of being successful for an employer went up a lot because that went away, that gaming. And then another thing happened this year that changed it, which is you have to go through this online registration where they do the lottery, and it was $10 last year, so essentially free. They raised it to $200 per entry this year, and that caused a big drop in the number of applications because people were sort of still incentivized to file lots and lots of these things, and now they had to be a little choosier about which ones they filed. So we all, as immigration lawyers, noticed that a much higher percentage of our clients actually were successful in the lottery than we've seen in some years. So that's good news. That if you're filing H-1Bs for folks in the United States, your odds are probably better than they were in the past. Now, you still have all the other stuff we've been talking about to deal with, but at least that part is the good news. But if you don't, if the H-1B is out for you for some reason or another, it's always been the case that there are alternate pathways. The O-1 visa for people that have extraordinary ability in their fields. We do notice a trend now with more requests for evidence in the O-1 category. We are tracking to see whether, just how hard it's getting. That has been typical, that we saw that the last time as well, where there was more of that. By the way, there is one piece of news about, when I mentioned those Biden changes that happened at the very end, one rule that he got into the big H-1B rule actually had an impact on O-1s and other categories. And it involves this concept called deference. Deference
Right.
is where where prior decisions of the agency have to be honored unless they can show that there's been some significant or material change in the circumstances of the company or the person that makes it appear that they're no longer eligible. That's a big deal with O1s, because what happened in the first Trump administration was there were a lot of people that were on O1 visas that got denied extensions
Okay.
because they were just applying a harder standard on it, and said, well, we don't care what the Biden, what we said in the Biden administration. This is a new sheriff in town, and we're taking a harder line on that. They're going to have a tougher time doing that now because of that January Biden regulation that got finalized. And then there are these other categories, the E2, there's L1s, there's, those are E2s are for treaty investors. There are 65 countries that have that status with the US, and that is still a good category. It's just, it depends very heavily on consular processing. E2s have to be adjudicated by consular officers that are E-treaty officers. We don't know how decimated they've been by the layoffs and the departures from the State Department. So that can make that category harder. NIWs are national interest waivers. It's a good green card category that's had some good case law over the last few years. That's one that a lot of people have been benefiting from the changes on artificial intelligence that are in the policy manual. But again, it's a subjective category like O1s and the others. So I tell clients sometimes that they say, what are my chances? And it's like, well, it depends on what the examiner had for breakfast.
Yeah.
On
Really.
there. I mean, so now there's generally speaking a lot more nervousness on the part of examiners. I mean, you got to remember, some of these people have been there for multiple administrations, and they have, the kind of this knee-jerk back and forth, being told to be friendly, being told to be, strict and all that. And they have to, they're sort of like seeing which way the wind is blowing when they're making decisions on these cases, and sometimes are being a lot more aggressive on there. The other thing that's sort of like, I think people need to pay attention to as well, where it's still a big unknown for us, is AI working its way into decisions. We have started to notice requests for evidence and denials that appear like they been getting some AI help on the examiner's language in there. We had been told that they were not using AI in decision making, but we think that it might be happening. We also know AI is working its way into the extreme vetting. So we know, for example, the students that a lot of the students that got trouble with the because of the campus protests, that they were using AI to comb their social media accounts, and that's how they were identifying people there. But that's also something that could be happening. You now have to give your social media account information in any category, not just the students. So it's something that, as HR folks, you're going to have to be counseling on for people that they should expect that's going to be happening.
So, I mean, look, let's move on to this into a bit more detail. But from what we discussed in advance, that you've actually seen removals based on those political opinions and what people have included on their social media posts. So, are we honestly having a conversation here where there's quite forensic surveillance on people's social media posts who are coming into the US?
Yeah, no, it's a legitimate risk. So the State Department says they're doing it. The president wants it done. We don't know, if it's beyond just Middle East politics, or what else is on their list of things that upset them. I don't know if you have a million things on there that says I hate Donald Trump on there, whether that's going to affect you or not. But it is something that certainly immigration lawyers are talking about. In fact, a friend of mine has developed sort of a screening tool to help employers figure out what that they, telling employers that you should be doing your own review of their of people's social media accounts, and then there's sort of like a watch list of things that are likely to be potentially triggering, which is hard to believe that the
Yeah.
US, that's a thing now. But that's something that probably I would tell people that you should not you should assume it's going to happen.
Sure. And so when you think of social media, I mean, we all use social media now, but really what we're looking at predominantly is students. And obviously, there's a huge international student population in the US.
Yeah,
But what are the
1.3
implications?
million students that are in the US on visas.
And so with that number, what could the impact be on future workforce supply, given the risks with these social media?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of downstream effects that are happening. First off, I should also mention that with the students, they started with speech. They've now moved on to removing students based on minor, really super minor brushes with the law, like speeding tickets or running a red light on there. And there's been so there were a couple hundred students, I think, that initially were targeted for speech. It looks like now there are 6,000 to 8,000 students that have had their electronic system records terminated by immigration and customs enforcement, and their visas revoked based on these minor brushes with the law, not on speech. So what's really worrying is that that's a lot of people in general, but it's also having this effect of causing a lot of people to think about whether they really want to study in the United States or not, and whether their parents want to spend a lot of money and put their kids in a risky situation of studying in the United States. And we already are hearing reports for the fall of big drop-offs in applications to study at U.S. universities. Now, with that said, the U.S. university system, particularly international students, are a major driver of the skilled worker workforce that a lot of industries depend on. And so there is a lot of concern now that, and that these students are not going to be there in a couple of years for probably not just a couple of years, like starting next year, that they're not going to be filling the positions that need to be filled in Silicon Valley and in the financial sector and all these other parts of the economy that depend on these international students. Remember, it's like I said, 1.3 million people. Now, a lot of them just come to the U.S. and they leave, but there are several 100,000 that usually try to find work in the United States at least for a few years, and then a lot of them permanently settle in the U.S. So this could have major disruptive effects on the long-term U.S. economy if this doesn't reverse itself soon.
That's I mean, it's hard to believe, but it's obviously the reality. But one of the points that you've mentioned there is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Colombia activist who's Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian student, is that who you're referring to? Perhaps you could maybe just give an overview of the situation.
Yeah, there have been several, and some of them have been. He's interesting because he's actually a permanent resident, and so it's normally very difficult to remove a permanent resident unless they are engaged in criminal activity. In this case, they are using a section of the Immigration Act that can allow somebody to be removed if they are basically interfering with the foreign policy of the United States. Seems like a big stretch to say that this kid is basically a threat to U.S. foreign policy, but that is the theory that they are using. It has not really worked its way up in the courts that quickly yet, and they moved him to Louisiana very quickly, hoping putting him in a detention center down there from New York, hoping that he would get a less friendly federal judge. It hasn't gotten to the federal judge yet. Starts out with an immigration judge and a lot of people say he wasn't successful in front of the immigration judge, but the immigration judges are all employees of the Department of Justice. They're not independent judges in the same way that judges in the federal court system are. So he really has not had his day in court essentially yet to make his arguments, and I think he is going to have a relatively easy time once he gets to federal court as far as his chances of winning. So I think the speech cases right now are probably all losers for the administration, but remains to be seen.
Indeed. I'm conscious of time, so I'll move on to the next slide. But what the final point there was what the implications are for hiring diverse talent. And married with that is what kind of disruption will there be at a sector level? We often have many webinars covering business implications. This is such a human topic that we've been discussing for the last 50 minutes or so. But how is this going to affect specific sectors like aerospace, academia, and specifically AI? Because obviously that's one of the hot topics and the focus of our.
So, I mean, keep in mind again that a lot of this is, I mean, some of the disruptions that are happening are not specifically immigration, but immigration's affected. And in the U.S., the two big changes that are happening at the same time are one, these massive cuts in federal spending at a lot of different agencies, including NASA, including the National Institutes of Health, including the Defense Department and DARPA, which deals with a lot of the AI research that's happening. So there are a lot of companies, private sector companies in the U.S. that support the research in those agencies, and that could mean a fairly significant drop in demand for workers in those spaces. So that's one thing that could affect overall numbers of people that are going to be transferring to the U.S. as immigrants in those particular categories. The other one relates to what we were talking about before, which is the universities. So yes. The universities, a lot of the research that happens in the U.S. in those sectors that you mentioned they're joint university private sector research projects that are happening.
Sure. Okay.
And the universities have also been not just under students, but under attack generally by the president, who has, some people may have heard about the fight that Harvard's having with the administration. Harvard gets billions of dollars of research funds from the administration for its projects. They have been cut off for now. They're in court on there, but a lot of big universities have been cut off from their federal funding, which means that the companies that are working with them on these research projects are also impacted. So that is something that I think we're in general going to see a decline in a lot of research and development that's happening in all those spaces because of those changes that are happening at both the government level and the university level on there. And then obviously there are immigration changes that we're seeing as well. So all of those combined, I think, are going to spell probably a lower levels of immigrants overall, and probably harder work for the ones that are coming in.
Absolutely. Let's just, as we begin to wrap up in the next couple of slides, and we do have a couple of questions. Where does Donald Trump stand on AI and AI immigration specifically? Greg, what are your thoughts?
Well, his AI executive order, like I said, was not that different than the Biden executive order. The one thing I think that's a little bit different is the Biden order, I think, was a lot more concerned about guardrails and security and sort of national defense. And I think Trump's been a lot more just in general about promoting AI by the private sector. I think this is one where Elon Musk probably had a lot to do with the way the AI order looked, but also he had a big meet and greet with Sam Altman and some of the big AI executives in the US that came to the White House. And it seems like on AI, he is very free market and very, and he's giving a lot of leeway to the AI companies. So that's probably one sector that should be thriving. But it's they're going to have the same challenges every other tech sector has for the reasons I just mentioned.
Absolutely. And we seem to have this AI sort of arms race across the world with Canada, the UK, and Germany. So it will be interesting to see how things unfold. And I've not even mentioned China as well. So
yeah, sure.
Interesting times ahead. We will just wrap up on this slide. We do have a couple of questions as well, but what are the takeaways for business? What can they do to keep things ticking along? And there is always going to be this demand of people wanting to relocate people to the United States. So how can businesses protect talent and also preserve their workforce stability?
I would just have a few tips that I would mention. One is that you should just start your processes earlier, particularly green card processing, because if you can actually get somebody a green card, the entries, the ability to enter the U.S. and have fewer problems, you have a lot less of that. So I would say start your green card processing earlier. Two, and we've talked about this, vetting your candidates closely to anticipate potential problems later on. You should, if you are going through that process on the front end, it's a lot less likely that you'll have problems, both because they're better prepared and also maybe you're not going to send certain candidates to the United States that after you've done that, where you in the past it wouldn't have been an issue and it is now. We are telling people to avoid unnecessary travel. And I'm hoping that this is just for over a couple months. We actually did see a lot of this in 2017, where we told, there was a lot of disruptions for travel and things got better. But right now we're just telling people it's like avoid encounters, avoid the necessity to go to a consulate, avoid encounters at the port, over document, have everything, have your folks with all their documents at consulates and at ports of entry so questions can be answered. And one last thing, devices. You don't have the traditional constitutional protections on search when you are entering at a port of entry, which means even U.S. citizens can have their phones searched, their laptops searched, and that's something as well. There are a lot of materials that are out there on what are best practices for advising folks about that, but be aware for your folks that they could have their devices searched.
And that could be on entry in the US. They could just have their phones taken. Wow. Yeah. Interesting. We may run over a couple of minutes. I do want to try and cover a couple of questions, but for those of you watching, we will record that we are recording this and we'll share the recording. From Nicole, who said that there's been recent examples of UK staff entering the US on an ESTA for business purposes being deported and receiving a 5-year ESTA ban. Can you talk to the point on a previous slide about visa waiver program tightening and considerations around that, please?
Yeah. So actually, on that, the visa waiver, there's visa interview waivers and then there's visa waivers. Visa interview waivers are where the initial one, that is one thing that they've been cracking down on, where there have been in the past, you could just submit an application online, drop your passport off and come pick your visa up at the consulate. We're seeing that a lot of new restrictions on that. Visa waiver and ESTA, that is for the what we're talking about there are the 40 or so countries where people can come to the U.S. without actually having to go to a consulate and getting a visa ahead of time. Yeah. So far, they are not making changes on the countries, and they're not making changes on ESTA and how the rules work. The letter of the programs themselves are not changing. What is changing, and I think this is what Nicole was talking about, is they are just giving tourists a lot more scrutiny than they have in the past. Right. And there have been instances of people that have been determined to be, where an officer decides that they're lying about something, slapping a fraud bar on them, which gets you a 5-year ban on coming to the U.S. And in some cases, even detaining people, which have made big headlines and actually drawn some travel warnings from several countries. I think Germany, Denmark, maybe the UK as well, about warning people that's happening and to be super cautious about it. So that is one of these things about over documenting and making sure that, I think a lot of times people might have been like, a little bit not quite forthcoming about everything that they're planning on doing in the US. And, that includes things like, we didn't even talk about like remote work, for example. I have people say it's fine if I just log in and work from the United States for my employer back home, isn't it? And it's like, no, the U.S. doesn't have actually any immigration exceptions for remote work. So that's something you just need to be really careful about complying with the rules for it. But if you're genuinely coming as a tourist and you have your documentation, or a business or short-term business visitor, and you can document your itinerary and your plane tickets and what you're going to be doing while you're here, and that's all completely clear. People are, the airports are still busy. People are still coming every day. I mean, in large numbers.
Great. And just a last couple of questions now, going back to the sort of employer-sponsored route. But we had a question prior to the webinar regarding alternative pathways, which we did cover previously. How realistic is it that companies can actually rely on O1s or the NIW or E2 as an alternative to something like the H1B or the L1 disruptions? And what are the pitfalls as well?
I mean, like I said, so far, those categories are working the way that they're supposed to be working. Yes, we are seeing more scrutiny, and again, the O1 is subjective, not objective. So you're going to see, generally speaking, examiners applying a tougher standard. But the O1 doesn't have a cap, and the E2 doesn't have a cap on there. And as long as you, like I said, you start early. If you have good candidates for those categories, I'd say that they are still very much available.
Okay, great. Final question from me then. One of the takeaways I think I've got from this conversation is that litigation is going to be a part of the jigsaw of immigration into the US. It might become something that will need to happen in order to facilitate essentially the relocation of people to the United States. Would you say that's accurate, and how, to what extent will litigation play in countering or slowing down immigration rollbacks under the second Trump term?
Well, it's already happening. Litigation there's hundreds and hundreds of immigration related cases that are already in the courts. Some of them are over small things, some of them over big things. And it depends to some extent on what the administration's plans are. They have taken a big slide in the polls. There have been about a 20% drop in approval ratings, and they may get less aggressive on trying to push out policy changes, knowing that that's happening. But I would say that on the more controversial policies that are coming out, that's almost a given that there's going to be lawsuits on anything that's controversial. But even on an individual basis, bad decisions, a lot of people I think are going to be a lot more willing to go to court to push back on a bad decision.
Great. We have run over by a couple of minutes, but this has been an incredibly fascinating conversation, Greg. We could talk for much longer. Just a final thank you to you for your participation, and also the preparation that we put into this has been, I don't know the best word to describe it really. It's fascinating, somewhat surprising in parts, but I think it will be very much see how things go in terms of what will lie ahead, Greg. But I just wanted to thank you for your participation in this conversation, and please do follow Greg and his company, and obviously Centurio Global, and we'd love it if you continue the conversation in the comments on the social media platform as well. So thank you very much, Greg, and thank you to all our audience who are watching today. And I'm sure we'll be following up with some more webinars and discussions on this topic in the near future.